While the world was watching peace talks, someone was making very different phone calls. On the morning of February 28th, 2026, the first day of the Iranian work and school week, right in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan, bombs started falling on Tehran, on Isfahan, on Qom, on Karaj, on Kermanshah. Cities that held tens of millions of people woke up to explosions lighting up their skies. American and Israeli jets had struck Iran in one of the most significant military operations the Middle East had ever seen. And within hours, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran with an iron fist for over 3 decades, was dead. The world was stunned. But behind the shock, behind the fire and the sirens, behind the diplomatic statements and the breaking news banners, there was a story that most people had not heard. A story that did not take place on a battlefield. It took place in private phone calls, in quiet meeting rooms, in hushed conversations between powerful men who were telling the world one thing and doing something completely different behind closed doors. Because while Saudi Arabia was standing in front of cameras calling for diplomacy, calling for peace, calling for dialogue and restraint, its crown prince Mohammed bin Salman was picking up the phone and personally pushing Donald Trump to go to war with Iran. Not once, not twice, multiple times, over the course of a full month. That is the real story, and that is where we begin. To understand why this matters so deeply, you have to go back. Not to last week, not to last year. You have to go back to 1979, because what happened on February 28th, 2026 was not born out of a single crisis. It was the conclusion of a conflict that had been building for nearly half a century. A conflict between two nations, two visions, two competing ideas about who controls the soul of the Middle East. In 1979, Iran was a monarchy. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, sat on the peacock throne. He was aligned with the West, and while his government was authoritarian, it was a monarchy that Saudi Arabia could understand and coexist with. The two countries competed for regional influence, but they competed within limits. The Gulf had a kind of uneasy but workable balance. Then came the Iranian Revolution, and everything changed. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini swept into power and transformed Iran into an Islamic republic. Suddenly, there was a completely different kind of force sitting right across the Persian Gulf from the Saudi kingdom. A revolutionary government. A Shia-led, anti-Western, ideologically aggressive state that openly declared its intention to export its revolution across the Muslim world. That was not a distant threat for Saudi Arabia. That was an immediate one. Iran's revolutionary ideology was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Saudi royal family. Saudi Arabia claimed its own religious authority through its custodianship of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities in Islam. Now Iran was sending a message that a different kind of Islamic government, not a monarchy, not a kingdom, but a revolutionary republic, was the true model for Muslims everywhere. If that message spread, it could undermine Saudi Arabia from the inside. So Riyadh backed Iraq when Saddam Hussein launched his war against Iran in 1980. Saudi Arabia funded that war. 8 years of brutal conflict followed. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. Chemical weapons were used, cities were reduced to rubble, and at the end of it, Iran was not destroyed. It was hardened. It came out of that war with a military and a revolutionary guard forged in the worst conditions imaginable. Iran emerged from it angrier, more ideological, and more determined than before. The Saudi calculation had failed, and Iran had learned something important. It was surrounded by enemies willing to fund wars against it, so it built its own strategy of survival. And that strategy became known as the axis of resistance. Over the following decades, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran transformed into what analysts began calling a new Middle East Cold War. The two countries stopped fighting each other directly. Instead, they funded, armed, and supported opposite sides in every conflict across the region. In Yemen, Saudi Arabia launched a military coalition to fight Houthi rebels who were trained, armed, and directed by Iran. In Syria, Saudi Arabia backed rebel groups trying to remove Bashar al-Assad, while Iran poured soldiers and money into keeping him in power. In Lebanon, Saudi Arabia watched with growing alarm as Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, became not just a militia, but the most powerful armed force in the entire country, stronger than the Lebanese National Army. In Iraq, Iran-backed militias became so deeply embedded in the Iraqi state that Tehran effectively had a hand on the levers of the Iraqi government itself. Every time Iran extended its reach into Lebanon, into Iraq, into Yemen, into Syria, Saudi Arabia felt it like a hand tightening around its throat, year by year, proxy by proxy, country by country. But something else was happening at the same time, a generational shift inside Saudi Arabia. For decades, Saudi Arabia had been led by cautious kings from the founding generation of the royal family, men who preferred to use money rather than military force, men who managed problems rather than confronting them head-on. But in 2017, a young man took effective control of the kingdom. His name was Mohammed bin Salman. He was 31 years old, and he was nothing like what came before him. MBS was impatient. He was bold. He was willing to take risks that older Saudi leaders would never have considered. He launched a war in Yemen almost immediately after taking power. He detained dozens of Saudi princes and businessmen in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh in an anti-corruption campaign. He ordered the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018, an act that stunned the world and isolated him internationally for a period. But through all of it, MBS kept his grip on power. He kept his relationship with Washington, and he kept his laser focus on the enemy he saw as the greatest threat to everything he was building, Iran. In 2018, MBS publicly compared Iran's supreme leader Khamenei to Adolf Hitler. Not a careful diplomatic statement, a raw, personal, furious comparison. He said Khamenei wanted to control the Islamic world the same way Hitler wanted to control Europe. That kind of language does not come from a policy brief. It comes from somewhere much deeper. It comes from a man who had been watching Iran work against his country his entire adult life and had decided the time for polite language was over. And MBS had very specific reasons for that fury. He was trying to build a new Saudi Arabia, a Saudi Arabia not dependent on oil, a Saudi Arabia with tourism, entertainment, technology, and foreign investment. He called it Vision 2030. It was an extraordinarily ambitious plan to transform one of the most conservative societies on earth into a modern, diversified economy within a single generation. Billions of dollars were being committed. Investors were arriving. Women were being allowed to drive. Concerts were happening for the first time in decades. But all of that required one thing above everything else: stability, regional stability. The sense that the Middle East was not about to explode into a war that would wipe out everything he was building. And Iran was the single biggest threat to that stability. In 2019, Iranian weapons delivered through Houthi proxies struck Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility, the single most critical piece of oil infrastructure in the world. The attack temporarily cut Saudi Arabia's oil production in half. It was the most significant strike on global energy infrastructure in modern history. For MBS, that was not just an attack on equipment. That was Iran reaching into the heart of Saudi Arabia and breaking something the entire kingdom depended on. And Saudi Arabia could not respond directly, because despite billions spent on American weapons, the Saudi military had never been built into the kind of battle-hardened force that could match Iran in open confrontation. Iran had missiles that could reach every Saudi city. Iran had drones that had already slipped through Saudi air defenses. Iran had proxy armies across 4 countries surrounding the peninsula. Saudi Arabia had money, it had American equipment, but it did not have the military machine to fight Iran and win. So MBS did what every truly dangerous leader does when they cannot fight directly. He played the long game. In 2023, something that looked like a diplomatic breakthrough happened. Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by China, signed an agreement to restore full diplomatic relations. Ambassadors were exchanged, embassies reopened. There were handshakes and photographs and talk of a new chapter. The world exhaled. The 2 great rivals of the Middle East, it seemed, were finally finding a way to coexist. But here is what was actually happening inside MBS's mind. He was not making peace. He was managing a pause. Saudi Arabia needed a calm regional environment to make Vision 2030 work. Foreign investors would not put their money into a kingdom that might be at war next year. The détente with Iran was a business calculation, a pressure release valve, not a peace treaty. Internally, Saudi Arabia never stopped watching Iran. The intelligence services never stopped tracking Iranian missile development or nuclear enrichment progress, never stopped counting the weapons flowing from Tehran to the Houthis in Yemen, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to militias in Iraq. The détente was a public performance. The surveillance was constant and private. And then, in June 2025, everything shifted again. The United States and Israel launched Operation Midnight Hammer, a coordinated series of airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear facilities. The Isfahan enrichment facility was struck. Satellite imagery confirmed the damage. American intelligence assessed that the strikes had set Iran's nuclear program back by approximately 2 years. The world held its breath, and it wondered whether this would end the crisis or begin something far worse. It turned out to be an intermission. Because in February 2026, the International Atomic Energy Agency made a discovery that changed everything. Inspectors found that Iran had been secretly hiding highly enriched uranium in an underground facility that had not been hit in the June 2025 strikes. The uranium was at an enrichment level that served no peaceful nuclear purpose. The IAEA stated publicly that it could no longer confirm that Iran's nuclear program was, in its own words, exclusively peaceful. Think about what that means. Iran had been sitting in negotiations. Iran had been sending diplomats to talk about deals. Iran had been publicly presenting itself as willing to engage. And the entire time, it had been hiding the most dangerous material in a secret location that no one knew about. The IAEA's statement was as close as that institution ever gets to saying Iran is building a nuclear weapon and lying to everyone about it. That discovery in February 2026 was the trigger, not just for Trump, not just for Netanyahu, but for MBS. Because a nuclear Iran was not a threat Saudi Arabia could manage with diplomacy or détente or phone calls to Beijing. A nuclear Iran would change the entire power structure of the Middle East permanently. Every conversation, every negotiation, every dispute would happen with a nuclear gun pointed at Riyadh. Iran would be untouchable forever. MBS picked up the phone. According to the Washington Post, citing 4 people directly familiar with the matter, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman made multiple private phone calls to Donald Trump over the course of a single month. In those calls, MBS pushed for a U.S. military strike on Iran, clearly, repeatedly. This was not a casual mention dropped at the end of a broader conversation. This was sustained, deliberate, targeted lobbying by the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, directly to the President of the United States. Call after call after call. And what makes this almost impossible to believe until you understand who MBS is and how he operates is what he was saying in public at the exact same time. Publicly, Saudi Arabia was the voice of reason. Saudi officials told reporters that Riyadh supported a diplomatic solution to the Iranian nuclear crisis. Saudi Arabia was positioned in every official statement and every public appearance as the measured, mature power in the region that wanted talks, not war. MBS himself was presenting the Saudi kingdom as a country that had moved beyond conflict. It was a masterclass in deception, and it served a very specific purpose. Because if MBS had publicly called for U.S. strikes on Iran, the consequences would have been severe. The Arab street, ordinary people across the Muslim world, would have been outraged. The idea of a Muslim king, the guardian of Mecca, calling for American bombs to fall on a Muslim nation during the holy month of Ramadan would have been incendiary. It would have cost Saudi Arabia enormous religious credibility. It would have fueled radicalism. It would have given Iran the narrative gift of claiming that Saudi Arabia had betrayed the Muslim world. He protected his image. He preserved his deniability. He had a crucial American partner, a man who was doing in public what MBS could only do in private, a man who was flying across the region, meeting leaders, delivering warnings, and counting down the clock out loud. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. In February 2026, Graham stood at the Munich Security Conference and delivered what can only be described as a war announcement dressed as a speech. He said the Iranian regime was at its weakest point since 1979. He compared Khamenei to Hitler. He announced he was heading immediately to Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia with one message: do not let this moment pass. And then he got on a plane. Graham flew to Abu Dhabi first. He met with UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, and there he told reporters something remarkable. He said the military capability was being built up as he spoke. He said the inflection point was weeks away, not months away. He was not speculating. He had been briefed. He knew. The USS Abraham Lincoln carrier was already in the Arabian Gulf at that point. The USS Gerald R. Ford was on its way. The hardware was moving into position. The operational planning was already in its final stages. Graham then flew to Saudi Arabia. And this is the part that was not publicly known until Middle East Eye reported it. The purpose of Graham's meeting with MBS was specifically to bring the Saudi Crown Prince on board with the planned attack on Iran. A U.S. official familiar with the matter told Middle East Eye directly. Graham went to Riyadh to get MBS to stand aside, and MBS did not vehemently oppose it. That phrase, did not vehemently oppose, is diplomatic language for gave his quiet approval. Graham posted about the visit on social media afterward. He called it consequential. He praised MBS and Vision 2030. He talked about the possibility of a new Middle East. Nothing in his post mentioned Iran, or strikes or war. But the U.S. official who spoke to Middle East Eye left no doubt about what the actual conversation was. And before Graham ever flew to Riyadh, the groundwork had already been laid deeper. In January 2026, Middle East Eye revealed that the Trump administration had quietly gone to Saudi Arabia's defense minister, Prince Khalid bin Salman, MBS's own younger brother, to make the case for supporting the United States during a future attack on Iran. They arrived with specific talking points. They explained how military strikes would reduce Iran's ballistic missile threat, how they would weaken Iran's ability to fund and direct its proxy forces, how a more vulnerable Iran would mean a more stable Gulf for Saudi Arabia's economic plans. That meeting in January was the first move on the chessboard. Graham's visit to Riyadh in late February was the closing move. The entire operation had been assembled piece by piece, conversation by conversation, phone call by phone call. And Saudi Arabia was not a bystander to it. Saudi Arabia was one of its architects. Meanwhile, Trump was receiving pressure from multiple directions at once. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had been pushing for American strikes on Iran for years. This was not new. Netanyahu had been making the case since the early 2000s that Iran's nuclear program was a threat not just to Israel, but to the entire world. He had lobbied every American president he dealt with to take a harder line against Iran. But Netanyahu was a known quantity. His position was public, documented, and expected. Everyone knew Netanyahu would always argue for confronting Iran. That advocacy carried weight, but it also carried its own kind of discount. MBS was different, and that difference mattered enormously. Saudi Arabia had officially signed a diplomatic restoration agreement with Iran in 2023. Saudi Arabia had officially been calling for dialogue. When a leader who had publicly embraced détente with Iran picks up the phone and privately tells the American president it is time to strike, that is a completely different signal. That tells Trump that even the Arab leader who made peace with Iran has concluded that peace was never real. That carries weight no public speech can match. U.S. officials also made clear that the negotiations with Iran had broken down from the inside. A senior official briefing reporters after the strikes said Iran had shown no genuine will to reach a deal. Washington had reportedly offered Iran guaranteed permanent nuclear fuel as a way to prove Iran did not need to enrich its own uranium. Iran turned it down. The official said Iran was buying time, not reaching an agreement. The combination came together in late February 2026, the IAEA's discovery of hidden enriched uranium, the collapsed negotiations, Netanyahu's sustained campaign, and MBS making personal phone calls to Trump, repeatedly, telling him now was the time. Trump made his decision. On the night of February 27th, going into the early hours of February 28th, the final preparations locked into place. 2 U.S. sources and a U.S. official confirmed afterward that the attack had been timed deliberately to coincide with a meeting Khamenei was holding with his top aides. The timing was chosen to maximize the chance of eliminating him and as many senior officials as possible in the opening salvo. At the early hours of February 28th, the first morning of the Iranian work week, deep in Ramadan, the strikes began. Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, Kermanshah. Multiple cities hit simultaneously. This was not a limited, targeted strike designed to send a message. This was a full military campaign built to do maximum damage to Iran's military infrastructure, its air defense systems, its nuclear program, and its leadership in a single coordinated assault. Iran's Supreme National Security Council Secretary Ali Shamkhani was killed. Senior Iranian officials across multiple departments were killed. And then came the news that changed everything in a single moment. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was dead. Israel had struck Khamenei's compound in the opening salvo. Israeli Ambassador Yechiel Leiter personally updated American officials that the mission had succeeded. Iranian state media went silent for hours. That silence was itself a confirmation for those who understood what it meant. Then, on March 1st, Iran's Supreme National Security Council confirmed it officially. The man who had ruled Iran since 1989, 35 years of absolute authority, was gone. The man who had built the axis of resistance, who had funded Hezbollah and made it the most powerful non-state military force in the world, who had armed the Houthis, who had directed Iran's decades-long drive toward a nuclear weapon, dead. Inside Iran, the reaction was unlike anything the country had experienced in a generation. People leaned out of windows in Tehran. Through Starlink satellite connections that Iranians were using to communicate with the outside world, accounts poured out. Joy, shock, disbelief, grief, rage, relief, all at the same time. One person wrote online, "I'm crying, laughing, screaming, and experiencing every feeling in the world in 3 seconds." Iran struck back, and it struck at everyone. Within hours, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps launched ballistic missiles and armed drones across the entire Persian Gulf region. The targets were not just Israel. They were American military bases in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Iraq. They were civilian airports in Kuwait and the UAE. They were tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. They were military facilities across 5 countries simultaneously. Iran was making a very specific point with every missile it fired. You wanted this war? Every one of you who helped make it possible is going to feel it. Iranian drones set a 5-star hotel in Dubai ablaze. A tower block in Bahrain was struck. Kuwait's international airport was targeted. A ballistic missile wounded 6 people in a residential area of West Jerusalem. At least 3 American soldiers were killed at U.S. bases across the Gulf. An Iranian missile penetrated Israel's air defense and struck the city of Beit Shemesh, killing at least 9 people. Oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz came under attack. The port of Duqm in Oman was hit by 2 drones. Global markets shuddered. Airlines rerouted. Governments issued emergency travel warnings. And then Iranian missiles reached Saudi soil. Iranian weapons targeted Prince Sultan Air Base and King Khalid International Airport. Saudi Arabia's air defense systems, including the Facade battery it had activated the previous year, intercepted them. But the targeting of Saudi Arabia was not accidental. It was deliberate. Iran was telling MBS directly, "We know what you did. We know about the phone calls. You're not going to hide behind American jets while your own airports go untouched." And here is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. MBS, the man who had spent a month publicly calling for peace while privately pushing Trump toward war, was now himself under Iranian missile attack. And his response was immediate, decisive, and completely public. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced that Saudi Arabia was ready to place all its capabilities at the disposal of its Gulf neighbors. The Saudi press agency released a statement condemning what it called the brutal Iranian attacks against fellow Gulf states. Saudi Arabia vowed to take all necessary measures to defend itself, including the option of responding to the aggression. The kingdom called Iran's strikes cowardly. It pledged full solidarity with every Arab nation that had been struck. The man who had publicly called for diplomacy was now publicly calling for war. The mask was completely off. And in a devastating irony, it was Iran that had pulled it off. By striking Saudi Arabia's own territory, Iran had given MBS exactly what he could not have manufactured for himself: a legitimate, public, internationally visible reason to stand against Tehran without apology and without any more double games. He was no longer the hidden architect. He was the victim. He was the defender of the Gulf. He was standing with his allies in the face of Iranian aggression. And Iran had done something even more damaging to its own cause in the process. By launching missiles at Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and Jordan all at the same time, Iran had united the entire Gulf against itself in a single night. Just weeks before, Saudi Arabia and the UAE had been in a bitter public dispute. The two countries had taken opposite sides in conflicts in Yemen, Sudan, and Somalia. Saudi-backed media had been attacking the UAE viciously. MBS and Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed had not spoken in months. Senator Graham had stood at the Munich Security Conference and publicly told them to knock it off, that their fight was emboldening Iran. The two most powerful Arab states in the Gulf were effectively at war with each other diplomatically. Then Iranian missiles started landing on both of their territories simultaneously. Within hours, MBS called MBZ for the first time in months. They condemned Iran together. They pledged full solidarity. The Saudi Crown Prince told the Emirati president that Saudi Arabia stood ready to put all its resources behind the UAE's defense. The rift that had been widening for months dissolved in the heat of Iranian ballistic missiles. Iran had done in one night what years of American diplomacy had failed to do. It had repaired the Saudi-Emirati relationship. Step back now and look at the full picture. Because the scale of what Saudi Arabia orchestrated, the sophistication of the strategy, the precision of the deception, deserves to be seen clearly. Saudi Arabia is the custodian of Mecca and Medina. Its king carries the title, servant of the two holy mosques, and this kingdom privately lobbied the United States to conduct military strikes on another Muslim nation during Ramadan. It did this while publicly calling for peace. It coordinated with American officials who were planning the attack. It allowed a U.S. senator to fly in and brief its crown prince on the operation days before it happened, and then it stood aside and let the bombs fall. And when Iran retaliated by striking Saudi soil, MBS used that retaliation as the public justification for the very position he had been holding privately all month long. This is the architecture of hidden power. This is how decisions that reshape the world actually get made. Not in public speeches, not in UN debates, in phone calls that were never supposed to be reported, in meetings whose purpose was never supposed to be revealed, in a quiet, sustained pressure campaign conducted behind the entire world's back. The Washington Post broke this story based on 4 unnamed sources. Middle East Eye confirmed the purpose of Graham's Riyadh visit through a U.S. official. The full picture will take years to emerge, but what has already come out is enough to understand that what looked to the world like an American and Israeli decision had a third architect sitting quietly in Riyadh, invisible to the cameras, making the most important calls of all. Now ask the question that the outrage usually prevents people from asking. Was MBS wrong? The double game is real and deserves scrutiny. But beneath the deception is a strategic argument that is not irrational, and it needs to be heard. Iran had been running covert operations in the Middle East for more than 4 decades. Hezbollah was Iran's weapon in Lebanon. The Houthis were Iran's weapon in Yemen. Iraqi militias were Iran's weapon in Baghdad. Iran had been playing a double game across the region for 45 years, using proxies to achieve outcomes while maintaining deniability. Saudi Arabia, by quietly backing American and Israeli military action while publicly advocating peace, was playing the same game, just for 1 month instead of 4 decades. The deeper argument MBS was making, though he would never say it publicly, was that the Iranian regime was simply never going to stop, that every negotiation was a stalling tactic, that the 2023 détente was Iran buying time to hide uranium in underground facilities inspectors would not find, that the only real change the Middle East would ever see was removing the regime that had been the engine of regional destruction since 1979. Whether you agree with that argument or not, it is not irrational. It is what the entire Gulf had been saying privately for years. Every Gulf state had watched Iran's reach expand year after year. Every one of them knew what a nuclear Iran would mean for their futures. The context is the thing the headlines cannot show you. The phone calls only make sense when you understand the 45-year war that came before them. And now comes the question that hangs over everything. What happens next? Iran has vowed to avenge Khamenei's killing, The IRGC declared that American military personnel and their equipment are legitimate targets anywhere in the region. Iranian missiles continued to fly for days after the initial strikes. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes every day, became a conflict zone. Saudi Arabia was using American THAAD technology to shoot down Iranian missiles in real time. The kingdom that had pushed for this war was now openly fighting in it. Senator Graham appeared on NBC's Meet the Press on March 1st and laid out what he saw as the next chapter. His explicit goal was normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. With the Iranian regime destabilized, the biggest structural obstacle to that normalization, Iran's ability to punish Arab states that moved toward peace with Israel was now weakened. Graham said that if the fall of the Iranian regime opened the door to Saudi-Israeli normalization, with Saudi Arabia at the center of Islam and Israel as the one and only Jewish state, that would be the most historic diplomatic achievement in a generation. This was always where the vision went, not just breaking Iran's nuclear program, not just removing Khamenei. Those were tactical goals. The strategic goal, the one Graham and MBS had spoken about directly, the one MBS had confirmed he was ready to pursue, was a completely new political map for the Middle East, Saudi-Israeli normalization. The Abraham Accords expanded to include the Arab world's most significant country. Iran's three-decade project of positioning itself as the Muslim world's protector against Israel and America collapsed under the weight of a regime that no longer existed. MBS had told Graham directly, if this regime goes down and opens up a new Middle East, he is ready. There is one final truth to sit with, one that cuts through all the strategy and the geopolitics and the carefully constructed deception. Saudi Arabia spent a month publicly saying it wanted peace, and privately saying it wanted war. Those two things cannot both be true at once. One of them was a performance. And the performance was the one the world was allowed to see. That gap between the public face and the private reality is not something MBS invented. It is not a Saudi specialty. It is how power has functioned since human beings first organized into states and competed for dominance. Ancient empires did it. Cold War superpowers did it in every theater of conflict for 45 years. Every major geopolitical event in recorded history has had a public face shown to the world and a private face where the real decisions were made. What is different here, what is rare enough to be remarkable, is that we actually found out. 4 sources spoke to the Washington Post. A U.S. official spoke to Middle East Eye. A U.S. senator admitted on live television that he had been in Saudi Arabia meeting with MBS. The curtain was pulled back, just enough to see the outline of what was behind it. And what was behind it was a 39-year-old crown prince who had been watching Iran threaten his country, undermine his vision, arm his enemies, and expand its reach for his entire adult life, who had built a trillion-dollar economic plan that required regional stability, who had signed a diplomatic deal with Iran in 2023 that he never believed would hold, who had calculated, in the way that only people who hold real power ever calculate, where the path forward actually lay. And he picked up the phone, quietly, privately, repeatedly. He called the most powerful man on earth and told him what needed to happen. The bombs fell. The supreme leader is dead. Iranian missiles are still flying. The Middle East is reshaping itself in real time. A region of nearly 500 million people navigating the consequences of decisions made in private rooms and on phone lines that were never supposed to be known about. And somewhere in Riyadh, in a palace built to project the image of a kingdom at peace, the man who made those phone calls is watching every piece of it unfold, watching the missiles he pushed for, watching the war he helped engineer, watching the region change in ways he spent years building toward, one quiet conversation at a time. He is not on any battlefield. He never will be. He is in a palace. And that is exactly where masterminds tend to be.